Good day, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you're listening, this is Laurie Laursen with the Wealthy LaLa Show. So today is episode 323, and I'm excited to share with you guys today. So I got a new book. It's called The Wisdom Codes: Ancient Words to Rewire Our Brains and Heal Our Hearts. And it's by Gregg Braden. So Gregg Braden is a good friend of Dr. Joe Dispenza's. I tried listening to and reading Dr. or Gregg's stuff before, found it a little hard for me at first. And what I found is that, other people are sometimes a bridge. And so Dr. Joe Dispenza for me was a bridge to understanding, to receiving, to enjoying Gregg Braden stuff. And, you might be opposite. So he talks at the beginning of this book that this book is kind of intended not necessarily as a front to back kind of book, but you can just open a page to whatever is being called. And so when I got it the other day, I'd actually opened it up and the chapter, or part 3 it's called, is loss. So the greatest loss is what dies inside of us while we live. And what I found really interesting is by reading this, okay, I gotta find it because I've just got to, where is it here? So embracing finality. It's the feeling of finality that defines the power of loss in our lives. When we lose a loved one, we sense that finality as we realize the body we once touched, held, laughed, and cried over no longer exists. Our senses struggle with the fact that in one moment someone is with us in the world, breathing the same air that we breathe and sharing all the things that define our human condition. And then in the next moment, they're gone. It's the emotional finality of our loss that confronts us head on and promises us that we will never be the same. Our feelings are telling us the truth. It's literally impossible for us to ever be the same because our loved one was the catalyst for a way of being that can no longer exist. It's the hugeness of this realization and the degree to which we embrace the depth of its meaning that determine the power we will find in our grief. Once we accept these facts and embrace their meaning, we find ourselves at the crossroad of choosing one of two different paths, very powerful paths. On one path, we deny our grief. In our denial, we attempt to live each day as if we are the same person, living in the same world as we did before we lost our loved one. On the second path, we accept our grief. And in our acceptance, we open the door to healing the grief, to the healing that grief brings to our doorstep. It's our willingness to accept our loss that we heal. And he goes on to say, so loss as a teacher of love. I really feel like I got to read this because this is just so good. It was so healing for me. So he says, the Greek philosopher, philosopher, God, I can't speak that word this morning. Aristotle noted, nature abhors a vacuum. His statement was based on his observation that nature does not allow anything to be empty for long. Grass grows when trees are removed from a hillside. Air fills a vessel when water it once contained is removed. And the perfect balance that we strive to maintain in our lives will be upset by nature's prime directive to create movement and change. So modern science supports Aristotle's observation. The equations that describe fractal systems, for example, confirm that balance will give way to chaos in search of a higher order of balance. It's the same with the vacuum in our lives created by the loss of someone who we love and care for. New relationships blossom, grow to fill the void of lost parents, friends, and lovers. And I'm also getting, like, with the time that's going on right now, it's loss of anything, that there's going to be something else that'll be filled. So then he goes on to say, there's an unspoken potential that each of us will lose the people and the ways of life that we cherish and hold the most dear. It's inevitable because nothing lasts forever. It's this fact that promises that we will experience loss in our lives and the grief that is a consequence, as well as the path to healing from loss. Whether it's the loss of a friend or a loved one, or the loss of a community and an entire way of life, the result is the same. Grief is nature's support system for reconciling loss and helping us to move forward with life in a healthy way. It is also nature's way to get us to feel our grief, even when we may be reluctant to do so. The only way to heal from loss is to feel what the absence of something or someone we love means in our lives. There's a direct relationship between the emotional trauma of grief and the degree that we allow ourselves to feel our loss. The relationship is this: the deeper the hurt, the more powerful the feelings, and the deeper we must reach inside of ourselves to find the love that will enable us to transcend the hurt. It's through our grief that we discover a deeper and sometimes surprising capacity to love. I'll just finish with this last little chapter, their little paragraph. Ancient people identified ways of thinking about loss that made it easier to feel and grieve. These perspectives couldn't change the source of life's deepest hurts. They couldn't change the fact that husbands were lost in battle, wives were lost in giving birth, and mysterious diseases took friends and loved ones in the prime of life. Rather, as they invited the wisdom codes of their traditions into their lives, they discovered a healthy perspective that allowed them to transcend the losses that they endured. Um, and he says, so there's one other one. I just got to keep going here. Almost done. A solo journey through the grief that follows loss. We temporarily experience emotional and physiological shock. And even when we're surrounded by the best intentioned friends and loved ones and receiving support, just as it is with fear, described earlier in the book, we can ultimately go through the gauntlet of grief alone. We ultimately go through the gauntlet of grief alone. No one can grieve for us. Grief is a solo journey. And that journey often leads us to a battleground within ourselves where we discover conflicting emotions and the feeling of being empty, numb, and isolated. With our conflicting emotions come the seemingly endless questions that loop tirelessly in our mind. Among them, will I ever feel better? What do I do now? Why is this happening? There is a strength that can only be known in the presence of loss and grief. And with that strength comes the reward of life's deepest levels of personal mastery. Oh, I got to read this part again because I found that this meant so much to me, for any of us that have experienced, because we're all going to experience some kind of hurt in our lives. The only way to heal from loss is to feel what the absence of something or someone we love means to us in our lives. There is a direct relationship between the emotional trauma of grief and the degree that we allow ourselves to feel our loss. The relationship is this: the deeper the hurt, the more powerful the feelings, and the deeper we must reach inside of ourselves to find that love that will enable us to transcend the hurt. It's through our grief that we discover a deeper and sometimes surprising capacity to love. Oh, when I read this yesterday, Wow. Because I mean, I'm sure all of you have experienced grief and loss in your life. And, sometimes we just want to make sense of it. Like, what's the point of this? What's the point of hurting to the depth that we've hurt? And it's through our grief that we discover a deeper and sometimes surprising capacity to love. There is a strength that can only be known in the presence of loss and grief. And with that strength comes the reward of life's deepest levels of personal mastery. I tell you, I can hear those words now. These are words that I would not have been able to hear before. So if you're finding that you're having a hard time hearing them, like you're kind of like, WTF, like what's the point, right? Like, oh, jeepers. I just feel like these words are just sort of resonating and rippling out in like through my body and through consciousness and through the world, that as I receive this and receive these words creating grief and loss to be transmuted into something, a surprising capacity to love, or a strength that comes that comes the reward of life's deepest levels of personal mastery. Yeah. There's no victim in that for me, you know. There's just an invitation to a greater capacity to love and a level of personal mastery, to allow grief and loss to be what they are. Grief and loss of a loved one, grief and loss of our health, grief and loss of, money or a home or a job, or right now even lives as we've ever known them before. There's that grief and loss of it. And that, can we turn this around or turn it into something, a greater capacity to love and a deeper level of personal mastery? This last few weeks or month or two or whatever has definitely invited me to that. And yeah, so I just yeah. Hmm. I just feel like it needs a moment. It needs some space. This is a big, we've all struggled with grief and loss in our lives. And yeah. And so if you're listening to these words and you're like, yeah, no, thank you, Laurie. I'm not looking for a greater capacity to love. I'm not looking for a deeper level of personal mastery. I'm just looking to feel better. And what if you will feel better through a greater capacity to love and deeper levels of personal mastery? And if you are even resisting that, that's okay. We only know what we know. Look how we've been taught to deal with grief and loss. Resist it, hate it, run from it, make it wrong. Yet it's like we're fighting the very nature of our life and living. Like we've never been told that we weren't going to die or that other people around us weren't going to die. And like, could you imagine? There's this reminding me of this. I'm just thinking of plants, like imagine if we cried over every stalk of grain that was cut down, or we cried over every tulip or something, like, do you get my point? Like, it's just to invite us to something different. Like, what if we allowed it to be something beautiful and allowed the beauty of the grief and loss? Not to be like, oh, well, they died. That's just too bad. Okay, well, I'm going to carry on and love my life. Well, no, not that either. But what if we could allow ourselves the grief and the loss in a beautiful way, in an honoring of the love that we had with them? Oh, an honoring of the, community we say we've moved out of, or the job that we're no longer at, or the financial situation that's different. Like, what if we could love that and we could love something new too? Really where we get stuck so often is when we think that life needs to stay and should stay the same. Yeah. So, anyways, on that note, I think I'm signing off for today. This was kind of an intense, deep. It was deep. It was a deep show. Deep. Anyways, you guys take care. I want to wish you a beautiful day. Thank you so much for tuning in and adoring you from here. Take care.